Palestinian militant group Hamas has carried out brutal acts of terror against Israeli civilians, and Israeli and American leaders are always keen to tell us how dangerous and evil Hamas is.
The inhumanity of Hamas.
I have no sympathy for Hamas.
That keep shelling Israel with thousands of rockets and mortar shells.
But what if I told you that Israel helped create Hamas? Officially, Hamas, which is the acronym for an Arabic phrase meaning Islamic Resistance Movement, was founded in 1987, at the start of the first Palestinian Intifada, or uprising against the Israeli occupation. But its roots were planted much earlier. The Hamas founder, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, was a half-blind, disabled Palestinian cleric and member of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Brotherhood had been repressed by the Egyptians in Gaza prior to 1967, but once the Israelis invaded and occupied the Strip, they didn't just turn a blind eye to these Islamists, they encouraged them. See, the Israelis, especially right-wing Israelis, wanted to undermine the power of the dominant Palestinian political force at that time, the nationalist PLO, at the heart of which was the secular Fatah party of Yasser Arafat, their bête noire.
بغصن الزيتون في يدي وببندقية الثائر في يدي.
By empowering Sheikh Yassin and the Muslim Brotherhood, Israeli leaders thought they could divide and rule the occupied Palestinians, play them off against each other, secular nationalists against religious Islamists. So in 1978, when Yassin wanted to officially register his Islamic Association, which was basically the precursor to Hamas, the Israelis were only too keen to help. Yassin built and grew a network of Islamist social institutions across Gaza, including schools and clubs and mosques, and Israel helped fund some of those projects. Most American politicians have no clue about any of this, although the former Republican Congressman Ron Paul once made this point on the floor of the House.
Hamas was encouraged and really started by Israel because they wanted Hamas to counteract Yasser Arafat.
Arafat
just gave terrorist regime Hamas $100 million.
Today, I'm also announcing $100 million in new U.S. funding for humanitarian assistance in both Gaza and the West Bank.
So what we're telling every terrorist organization in the world is all you got to do is go commit the second deadliest act towards Jews in the history of Earth, only right behind the Holocaust. That's all you got to do, and you'll get $100 million. Here you go.
The role that we played in the creation of the State of Israel, and we will certainly mark the centenary. We are proud of the role that we played in the creation of the State of Israel, and we will certainly mark the centenary with pride.
This was what Theresa May had to say.
We are proud of the role that we played in the creation of the State of Israel, and we will certainly mark the centenary with pride.
This was what Theresa May had to say about the 100-year anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. But what exactly happened on November 2nd, 1917, and what was the Balfour Declaration all about? These 68 words were a historic promise given to the early Zionist movement by the British government for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Sir Arthur Balfour, then Foreign Secretary of Britain, wrote in a public letter to a famous British Zionist, Lord Walter Rothschild, which read,
His Majesty's government views with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country.
U.S. foreign policy over the last 15 to 25 years hasn't really been working on delivering the goods, on making sure that America is safe and secure, and at the same time being cognizant of the economic and human costs of our engagements. If the United States had followed a more realist or restrained approach to the world, then it's not as if Libya or Iraq would be thriving liberal democracies. A foreign policy of restraint isn't going to create heaven on earth. But neither is a policy of primacy. In fact, primacy has often led the United States to create situations where there's greater instability, more problems, lots of unintended consequences that have spilled over to other places. And Iraq is a perfect example of that. ISIS would not exist in Iraq had it not been for the United States opening Pandora's box by our regime change efforts. And that obviously spilled over to places like Syria. You'd also have some of these problems with our allies like Turkey related to some of the issues dealing with the Kurds. The problem is that these war aims expanded well beyond what was possible, and again, really thought through what the ideal would be without thinking about the constraints that meant reality would look a lot different than that ideal. It would be great if Afghanistan were a liberal democracy, thriving economically, and not a place where folks like Al-Qaeda could operate out of. The problem is that that wasn't really in the cards. And so you had situations, for example, like in Helmand, where General McChrystal sent government in a box. And what ended up happening, as General McChrystal later said, is that you got a bleeding ulcer in that country. So these efforts at trying to nation build are often unnecessary for America's core security interests and really impossible to realize in any kind of short run and at a cost that we really think is appropriate given what we need to achieve as opposed to what might be ideal. And so we've really opened up all kinds of challenges in this attempt to create an exemplar for the Middle East. We actually have created an exemplar of what could go wrong if you engage in the world without first thinking carefully about what is necessary for American safety and what those unintended consequences of our behavior could be, and how that spills back over into the United States in terms of the effects on Americans, the effects on our system of government and our civil liberties, and really thinking about those human costs, because oftentimes we forget that there is a real price to be paid. So, for example, when the United States has intervened in places like Iraq and Libya, there's been a huge human cost with thousands of American lives lost, tens of thousands of Americans harmed by that conflict, and a real human cost at home on families and communities, not to mention the cost to those we're ostensibly trying to help in places like Libya and Iraq. And so there are lots of unintended consequences of not following a more prudential or realistic approach to the world.
Somebody who tells what he wants to tell.
As the U.S. government confirmed.
As well as the U.S. government, I don't trust the U.S. government.
Oh, but you trust the Syrian government, do you?
I don't trust the Syrian either. What I do is
what you just said is exactly propaganda coming out of Damascus.
If you want to speak alone, you speak alone, but you are not going to say the truth. The truth
well, no, I'm hearing lies. This is why I'm speaking against them.
The truth is that for the 5 years, we have been told in France and in Europe, we are going to get rid of Bashar. In this Syrian army, you have 80% of the Sunnites. Secondly, there are all the Christian minority who support this regime. Of course, he has got opponents, but those opponents, they are mainly al-Nusra, bound to Al-Qaeda, and the Islamic State. So there is no surprise.
Assad and the Islamic State have been ignoring each other, according to Jane's defense, as of June 2014.
You Americans have created the
This is a British
State.
firm I'm quoting now.
Well, okay. The Islamic State
We created the Islamic State
by the American policy, the fundings that
Bashar al-Assad's Mukhabarat was sending jihadists into Iraq to blow up American soldiers for 8 years.
Okay, we have a devil to combat.
Yes, his name is Bashar al-Assad, sir.
No.
The CIA, from the very beginning, at least as early as 1951, has used the information that it has collected, and it has used the information in order to penetrate and to manipulate the institutions of power in whatever country it is operating in order to influence the course of events in those countries. And essentially, this boils down to propping up those forces which are considered to be the friendly forces, and in penetrating, dividing, weakening, and ultimately destroying those forces which are considered to be the enemy forces.
It was the West who created ISIS, both directly and indirectly. Don't shake your head. Even Tony Blair accepts that. President Obama made the case very clearly just a month or two ago. ISIS, he said, grew out of our invasion and occupation of Iraq.
What happens when a group of men are let loose in the wilderness with no oversight and a simple instruction? Kill anything that moves. Tiger Force is the answer. An elite recon group of the Vietnam War whose war crimes were covered up by the US government for decades. In this video, we look at the atrocities committed by the men of Tiger Force as they descended into barbarity in the jungle of Vietnam. and how the US government tried to hide it from the world. Tiger Force was a long-range reconnaissance patrol unit of the 1st Battalion, 327th Infantry, 101st Airborne Division. It was formed in November 1965 by Major David Hackworth to, quote, out-guerrilla the guerrillas. He put it more frankly to another reporter, "I want 40 swinging dicks," Hackworth had said. Men who were free to use their own judgment, skill and drive to conduct unrestrained warfare in the toughest areas of Vietnam. It usually numbered about 45 men at any one time, but people would rotate out every few months. For example, 120 men served in the Tiger Force between July and December 1967. Usually, Tiger Force would be dropped into an operational area and given effectively free rein to achieve their goal. Military command maintained minimal oversight of their activities. So long as they racked up a body count, the brass were happy. Many soldiers embraced the freedom and lack of bureaucracy that Tiger Force provided, but the absence of accountability or oversight would lead the men of Tiger Force down a dark path. The events that would enshrine them in the history books began to unfold in summer 1967, when the Tiger Force was sent into the Song Ve Valley. The Song Ve Valley was an agricultural hotspot that was allegedly a hiding place for the Viet Cong, VC, and North Vietnamese Army, NVA. Tiger Force was instructed to clear out remaining residents of the valley to a nearby refugee camp and then sweep the area for VC soldiers and food caches. The valley was declared a free-fire area. Shoot first, ask questions later. Civilian casualties were still unacceptable in theory, but enforcing that condition was a whole other matter. The commanding officer for the Song Ve deployment was Lieutenant James Hawkins. Hawkins was a bombastic and egotistical man whose responsibility would become an ongoing issue. It would be impractical to go over every member of the Tiger Force here. We will name a few as we go, but two to keep in mind are Specialist Ken Green and Private Sam Ibarra. Green and Ibarra were childhood friends who enlisted together and volunteered for Tiger Force side by side. These were ordinary men from ordinary backgrounds, but their time in Tiger Force would irrevocably change them. Soon after arriving in Song Ve, Tiger Force encountered a lone hut. A man emerged and fired on the soldiers. Tiger Force returned fire and shredded both the man and his hut. It was only afterwards that soldiers inspected the hut and found the man's wife and baby inside. Both had been killed in the crossfire. It was a classic case of collateral damage, the sort of thing that American units in Vietnam had come to accept as inevitable. It was a dire foreshadowing of things to come. Tiger Force endured ambushes, tripwires, bamboo traps, leeches, venomous snakes, malnutrition, and lack of sleep as they slogged through the valley. This left them irritable and frustrated. The paranoia of knowing that an enemy could lurk in every tree or every hut primed them to shoot at everything that moved. Tiger Force became especially angry with the villagers who refused to leave their homes, or who quietly snuck back once the Americans had left. It didn't take long for the abuse to start. Soldiers started to assault villagers who wouldn't move or robbing the ones who did. They eventually took to burning the huts to ensure that no one could return. Private Ibarra enjoyed the burnings. Ibarra and Green's contempt reached boiling point during one village clearance where they found an unarmed man hiding under a table. Ibarra and Green dragged him outside and beat him bloody. They said his scarf marked him out as an NVA soldier. That was enough for Ibarra, who took out his knife and slit the man's throat. Green and the other soldiers were taken aback at first, but no one complained and no one reported it. It was perhaps Ibarra's first murder, but not the last. Alcohol only made things worse. Several weeks after entering the valley, some of the Tigers, including Lieutenant Hawkins, got a man walking along the road. The soldiers beat the man with the butts of their rifles, but this caused an argument among the soldiers about mistreatment of civilians. Hawkins settled it quickly when he pulled out his rifle and unloaded into the defenseless old man. The soldiers might have put it down to drunkenness, except Hawkins did almost the same thing the next day. 2 elderly women approached the soldiers, but Hawkins shot them before they reached him. Lieutenant Donald Wood put his foot down. He was furious and demanded that Hawkins explain himself, but Hawkins was unapologetic. The free fire zone had been declared after all. Anything in this valley is ours, Hawkins told him. There are no friendlies, do you hear me? No one is supposed to live here.
Have you heard about the AK-47? I'm sure you know this is an assault rifle. It is one of the most popular ones out there. The AK-47 was originally developed by the Soviet Union, but it reached the Afghan Mujahideen during the 1980s. And since then, it has become a symbol of terrorists and terror groups. But now these groups are looking to trade up. They want NATO-grade weapons. And guess who is selling it to them? The Taliban. The rulers of Kabul have now become arms dealers. But how did this happen? You see, the Taliban came to power in the year 2021. It was a sudden power grab. The US military was forced to retreat. It was a hasty withdrawal. They left behind weapons, and a lot of them at that. Now, these weapons are flowing from Afghanistan into the global market. Basically, the Taliban is selling them. And who are the buyers? Anyone who is willing to pay the price, insurgent groups, and a lot of them at that. Now, these weapons are flowing from Afghanistan into the global market. Basically, the Taliban is selling them. And who are the buyers? Anyone who is willing to pay the price, insurgent groups, terrorists, militias, from the Al-Shabaab in Africa to the TTP in neighboring Pakistan, everyone who can afford to buy these weapons is buying them. And how many weapons are we talking about? The US left behind equipment worth $7.12 billion in Afghanistan.
Ever since his existence, when it comes to definitely black people. And during the time of the president Buhari out there in Nigeria, which is the previous president before the new puppet president that was actually put in, there are some, sisters talking about, France and what they have caused in Nigeria. Because remember, Mali has said that France is the one that caused and created Boko Haram in Nigeria. Let's roll that.
So the message could be relayed to the French authorities wherever they are in France that Nigeria is indeed a sovereign country, and as such, any form or attempt to compromise our territorial integrity will be resisted wholeheartedly. At this point, I want to stress, Nigeria was not colonized by France. Therefore, they have no business coming to toy with our lives here. We are aware that some vested interest was not happy with the gains made by the Nigerian government and especially our dear President Muhammad Buhari, in the fight against terrorism. As such, they began providing logistic support under a cover called humanitarian whatever to the Boko Haram fighters. They also assumed the role of the mouthpiece of the Boko Haram terrorist group. They use their state medium to promote their nefarious activities and to give them the needed psychological boost, claiming human rights for people that have been raised, trained to kill fellow Nigerians by them. The movement against slavery and terrorism wishes to state categorically and on unequivocal terms that France is indeed responsible for the resurgence of Boko Haram attacks in Nigeria. The movement against slavery and terrorism wishes to inform the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, that the world is indeed watching closely, and we, especially Nigerians, are also watching very closely. And should the French authorities not halt the spread of terrorism in Nigeria, the day of reckoning is indeed near.
We came, we saw, he died.
Did it have anything to do with your visit?
No, I'm sure it did.
So, that is the land of unconfirmed reports.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
Did it have anything to do with your visit?
No, I'm sure it did.
So, that is the land of unconfirmed reports.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
Secretary, let's turn, if we can, to Libya. The UN and human rights groups are calling for an investigation, saying that if, as it appears from the videotape, that Gaddafi was executed, it was a war crime. And you're also coming under fire for what you said.
We came, we saw, he died.
question. Do you regret what you said, Secretary? And if I may, do you regret what you said? And do you feel Gaddafi was wronged or that he got what was coming to him?
Well, let's have an investigation. I fully support the United Nations investigation, and I fully support the Transitional National Council's own call for an independent investigation. I support it on the merits because it's important to find the facts, and I support it as part of what will be a challenging transition process. You know, the Transitional National Council today is going to declare the liberation of Libya. They are then going to announce a new government. They need to make it clear that it will be a government to unify the country, to seek reconciliation, to make everyone who supported the former regime, as long as they don't have blood on their hands, feel safe and included in a new Libya. And so from my perspective, I think such an investigation would be very important to establish accountability, rule of law, and pave the way for the inclusive democratic future that unconfirmed. Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
Does the U.S. create terrorists? Well, when comparing the 10-year periods before and after, some conservative sources have blamed a weak foreign policy and political infighting for this massive increase. However, one political scientist has attributed 95% of suicide attacks in recent years to foreign occupation. And a 2004 government study concluded that the invasion has, quote, paradoxically elevated the stature of and support for radical Islamists. As it turns out, this isn't a new phenomenon. Back in the 1950s, the CIA coined the term blowback to describe the unintended consequences of overthrowing a Middle Eastern regime.
Help the bomber get a fake passport. All the kids do it.
President Bush reframed the war on drugs to make it part of the global war on terror.
And the drug trade supports terrorist networks.
The White House spent around $4 million on 2 Super Bowl ads in 2002 saying so. The Drug Enforcement Administration embraced its new role and began assembling the tools it needed to pursue narco-terrorists anywhere in the world.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment.
They got a statute added to the Patriot Act, which
makes it a federal crime to engage in drug trafficking that directly or indirectly aids or provides support to a foreign terrorist organization.
By 2007, the agency was armed with a 75% increase in its international budget. But there was just one problem.
In almost all of those cases, the nexus between drugs and terror happens through an informant who is working for the DEA. In other words, it's created or manufactured by the DEA's own conspiracy.
Phoenix noticed a flurry of gun purchases in the United States. In late 2009, ATF agents in Phoenix noticed a flurry of gun purchases in the United States by suspected traffickers from Mexican drug cartels, including giant .50 caliber rifles. But instead of stopping the weapons, agents say their superiors ordered them to let the guns cross the border. It's called gun walking. To see where they ended up and see if they would lead to a major drug cartel leader. Agents videotaped suspected dealers from Mexican drug cartels buying weapons. The case grew to include thousands of weapons. Then, in December 2010, 2 Fast and Furious rifles turned up at the murder of a Border Patrol agent in Arizona, Brian Terry. The Justice
CIA. 10 years later, Gary Webb was working at the San Jose Mercury News when he uncovered the story tucked away inside of a Senate subcommittee report. The report showed that the CIA was very closely tied to illegal cocaine smuggling in 1985. Webb started out skeptical, but eventually published a series called Dark Alliance. Then Webb's life fell apart. One by one, news agencies started to pick him apart, trying their best to discredit his story. Eventually, his own employer piled on and pushed him out. Webb went on to kill himself in 2004. And now the Contra cocaine scandal is being retold in a new movie called Kill the Messenger, starring Jeremy Renner. Webb is gone, but the AP reporter who first broke the story is still alive today, and he's joining us to talk about the lost history of the cocaine controversy. His name's Robert Perry. He's the editor of Consortium News. Robert, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Robert, from what you know and your investigation into this story, the cocaine, hang on, this is now I'm all screwed up. This is Robert, welcome to the show. Thank you. Robert, this new movie coming out, Kill the Messenger, do you expect it to be fairly accurate to what you know about the CIA?
Well, I haven't seen the movie yet, so it's hard to say what exactly Hollywood has done with this. What I understand is they try to be pretty careful in dealing with most of the key facts in terms of being generally accurate. They did compress some of the information, I understand, but people that have seen the movie tell me that it's reasonably close to what actually happened.
Now, you wrote a piece back in 1985 tying the CIA to the Nicaraguan Contra cocaine trafficking. Can you tell us what happened? Walk us through that whole scenario.
Well, in the mid-1980s, the Reagan administration had been supporting these Contra rebels in Nicaragua fighting against the leftist Sandinista government. Congress had cut off funding for the Contras because of human rights and other problems. That raised the question, how were they sustaining themselves in the field? How were they funding their operations? So Brian Barger and I, working at the Associated Press, began looking into that issue, following the money, basically. And one thing that we came upon was that pretty much all the major Contra organizations were augmenting their funding by working with drug traffickers.
Issue at the White House, where Secret Service is now investigating suspected cocaine discovered inside of the White House. Illegal drug there found somewhere inside of the White House. So this is the latest reporting from Fox News' Jackie Heinrich saying Secret Service confirms the substance reportedly identified on a preliminary test as cocaine has been sent for additional tests, and a probe into how it entered the White House is ongoing. Remember